You were never meant to hear this. What I'm about to reveal was locked away in sealed county ledgers, scrubbed from medical archives, and buried in whispered folklore passed only at firesides when the whiskey had dulled men's fear. But secrets do not stay buried. And the boy I'm about to tell you about, Timothy Caldwell, Sedalia, Missouri, 1867, was not a child like others. He was something else. A mirror held up to the human race, showing us what hides beneath the skin when innocence is only a mask. Imagine this. A small farm community, still bleeding from the Civil War. Men broken by battles they could not win. Women thinned by grief and sickness. Children scattered, fatherless, raised by neighbors too weary to love them properly. And into that fragile landscape stepped an 8-year-old boy with pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink long enough. He smiled at the right times. He said, "Yes, sir, and yes, ma'am," exactly as expected. But those who met his gaze really met it, described a pressure, like something ancient was looking out through that child's face, studying them with clinical detachment, as if they were the experiment. The first death could be written off as accident. A little girl, Mary Fletcher, drowned in water so shallow her knees should have saved her. The second, an immigrant logger at Devil's Bluff, could be fate, a simple fall. But when the bodies multiplied, when the livestock began to rot without wound or cause, when neighbors whispered of chickens panicking at the boy's mere presence, the mask slipped. They started to understand that Timothy wasn't just a child. He was a disruption, an intrusion into the natural order. The local physician, Dr. Samuel Harding, kept journals. 3 leather-bound volumes filled with clinical notes, details too sharp, too precise to dismiss as gossip. Harding had seen battlefield horrors, gangrene eating men alive, fever that blackened lungs, but nothing shook him like this boy. His handwriting, once neat, frayed across the pages as if he were documenting something not merely medical, but forbidden. And then the records stop. Closed, sealed, vanished into hidden archives. Why? Because Timothy Caldwell represented a truth too corrosive for America's growing myth of innocence and progress. He was proof that corruption doesn't wait for age, that sometimes the rot begins at birth. And tonight, I'm going to lead you down the trail they tried to erase, step by step, death by death, until you see, with your own eyes, why this child terrified an entire county, and why his story still whispers through the walls of history like a curse that never died. The records tell us Timothy arrived at the Caldwell farm in the spring of 1866, carrying only a cloth bag and eyes too old for his face. But you need to understand something. This was not just a boy abandoned by circumstance. This was a transplant, an insertion, a variable introduced into a fragile human equation already cracking under famine, sickness, and post-war despair. His Uncle Thomas, hardened by war, and his Aunt Sarah, sharp-tongued from years of bitterness, took him in because they had no choice. Yet from the very first week, they reported something subtle. Silence. A silence too heavy for a child. Timothy worked without complaint. He did chores from dawn to dusk, his thin frame never faltering, his hands never asking for rest. Children, even the most obedient, are supposed to stumble, to play, to laugh when no one is watching. But this boy did not. Neighbors described him as machine-like, steady, efficient, never distracted by curiosity. One woman said it best. It was as if he was practicing being human, but never quite getting it right. And then came the animals. Horses shying away from his touch. Dogs growling low when he crossed their path. Chickens clumping together in frantic clusters at the edge of the fence line, refusing to come near. You may dismiss this animal's sense things, yes, but often it's coincidence. Except in Sedalia, they began to notice a pattern. Every creature Timothy handled eventually sickened or disappeared. Dr. Harding, the physician, wrote of his first encounter. The boy looked at me not as a patient looks at his doctor, nor as a child looks at an elder, but as an examiner regards a specimen. I felt, for the first time in my professional life, as if I were being dissected by his gaze. That was Harding, a man who had amputated limbs without chloroform on muddy battlefields, confessing that a child's stare unstrung his nerves. And here is where the descent begins to steepen, because in August of that same year, the first accident struck. Little Mary Fletcher, 5 years old, drowned in water so shallow her father could have stood in it with boots dry. Timothy was the one who found her. He was the one who knocked on the door, voice calm, clothing damp, delivering the news like a messenger delivering a letter. At the funeral, adults wept until they collapsed, but Timothy's face remained unreadable. No tears, no trembling, only pale eyes watching everything, studying grief like an experiment in progress. That was the first death. It would not be the last. 3 weeks after the drowning of Mary Fletcher, the second death arrived, this time an old man, Henrik Larsson, a Norwegian immigrant who spent his twilight years tending bees on a bluff overlooking the creek. Everyone knew his routine. Everyone knew he climbed the rocks at dawn, checked the hives, and returned by mid-morning with combs of honey. On that September day, Henrik didn't return. And once again, it was Timothy who made the discovery. He told the neighbors he'd seen Henrik's hat caught in a thorn bush near the base of Devil's Bluff. His voice, they recalled, was steady, calm, almost detached, as he explained how he climbed down to investigate. There they found Henrik's body, neck broken, limbs twisted, face frozen in an expression of surprise. The coroner ruled it a fall, an accident, as anyone might have expected from a man past his prime. But Harding's journals note something unsettling. Henrik's body showed bruises not consistent with a single impact. Multiple contusions, as though he had been struck before he fell. And once again, Timothy described the scene with unnerving precision, every detail, every angle of the corpse, the exact place where the blood darkened the stone. Harding wrote, "The boy does not recall as children do. He recalls as one recording a specimen for future study." The town whispered, but dismissed it as coincidence, until the third death forced their silence into suspicion. A farmhand named Joseph Weller, barely 17, was crushed beneath a wagon just outside the Caldwell property. The horses had bolted suddenly. Spooked, neighbors said, though no thunder rolled and no snakes slithered near. The only witness was Timothy, who claimed Joseph had been trying to calm the animals when he slipped. But Harding, arriving at the scene, found no tracks suggesting a slip. Instead, he found the farmhand's cap positioned neatly beside the wheel, as though it had been placed there after the fact. 3 deaths, all connected by one boy's presence. 3 deaths, all written off as cruel chance. Yet those who lived near him began to notice how the air seemed to change when Timothy entered a room, how conversation would falter, how the hair on the back of the neck would rise. As if the body knew a truth the mind dared not speak. By winter's first frost, Sedalia was a community choking on fear but bound by silence. And in that silence, Timothy Caldwell grew stronger. By the end of 1866, whispers had begun to rot into suspicion. People avoided speaking Timothy's name aloud, as though it summoned something into the room. Mothers tugged their children closer when he passed in the dusty lanes of Sedalia. Farmers swore their cattle grew restless whenever he lingered by the fence. And yet, when anyone confronted him, Timothy was unfailingly polite. He'd bow his head, offer a soft "yes, ma'am," and walk away with the quiet composure of a boy perfectly disciplined. But beneath that calm, every death carved a deeper wound into the community's sanity. Dr. Samuel Harding was the first to act on the unease. He had treated Timothy for a minor cut one evening, binding the boy's hand after a farm tool slipped. During that simple encounter, Harding noticed something that froze him. Timothy never flinched. Not when the wound was cleaned, not when the iodine burned, not even when the thread bit into flesh. The boy sat perfectly still, watching Harding's face, his pale eyes unblinking, as though measuring every twitch of the doctor's own discomfort. Harding wrote, "There is no pain response. None. Only observation, as though sensation does not exist in him or as though he chooses not to show it." It was then Harding began his journals. He wrote late into the night, candlelight bending across ink-smeared pages, trying to reconcile what he saw with what medicine had taught him. Children cry. They fear needles. They shake under the lash of fever. But Timothy Caldwell? He simply endured, recording suffering in silence, as though he was not participant but spectator. And Harding noticed more. Timothy's memory was precise, unnaturally so. He could recall the exact order of hymns at church weeks later, the precise number of cattle in a neighbor's herd, even the smallest details of a stranger's clothing after only a passing glance. These were not the scattered recollections of childhood. These were catalogs, mental inventories like a mind gathering data for purposes no one could fathom. The townsfolk began to see him as an omen. When he walked into a room, laughter died. When he touched a tool, accidents followed. And every tragedy, everyone seemed to circle back to him, as if he were not merely present, but central. Harding began to wonder in private. Was Timothy the cause, or merely the carrier? A vessel of some darker current flowing through Sedalia? The doctor's doubt was the community's unspoken dread. And it was only a matter of time before that dread demanded an answer. By the spring of 1867, Sedalia's unease had sharpened into something heavier, something that clung to the lungs like damp air. It was no longer whispered curiosity, it was open fear. People crossed the street when they saw Timothy walking toward town. Shopkeepers made excuses not to serve him. Even children, who once tried to play at the edge of the Caldwell farm, now ran at the first sight of his pale figure in the fields. The boy was not hated. Hatred is a hot, violent thing. Timothy inspired something colder. The instinct to recoil the way one recoils from a corpse. Stories began to spread like infection. A farmhand swore his shadow moved differently when Timothy stood behind him. A woman claimed she'd seen her reflection twist unnaturally in her washbasin the morning after Timothy passed her gate. Others said the boy's voice sometimes carried in two tones at once, a soft child's murmur shadowed by something lower, something too old. None of these things were ever proven, but proof was not required. Fear does not ask for evidence. It grows from the marrow outward. Dr. Harding, meanwhile, deepened his observations. He noted that wherever Timothy lingered, tension followed. Livestock broke fences. Tools snapped in strong hands. Tempers flared between neighbors who once shared bread. Harding described it not as misfortune but contagion, writing, "The boy radiates unease, not unlike a pestilence. He does not strike directly, but the world bends around him until it breaks." And Timothy himself? He seemed aware of the distance forming around him. Yet he never complained. If anything, he leaned into the solitude, working longer hours, standing at the edge of the creek until dusk as though waiting for something or someone that never came. Witnesses often saw him staring into the water, not at his reflection but through it, as if the current were a window to another place. One evening, Elenina Patterson, the neighbor whose chickens had panicked at Timothy's presence, swore she saw him standing in her pasture, perfectly still in the moonlight, arms at his sides. She called out, but he did not answer. Only when her husband approached with a lantern did Timothy turn, smile faintly and say, "Good evening, ma'am. I was just looking at what," he never explained. The town began to move as though circling a contagion, each step tighter, each eye sharper, waiting for the next body to fall. And it did. The summer of 1867 did not arrive with warmth. It arrived with another body. This time it was not a child, not an elder, not a solitary wanderer at the edge of town. It was Sarah Caldwell, Timothy's own aunt. Neighbors said she had been hanging laundry in the yard, her arms red with soap, her hair tied back in a rag. By sundown she was found lifeless at the base of the clothesline, neck broken, eyes wide, mouth twisted in a gasp that never left her lungs. The official cause? An accident, a misstep on the uneven ground, perhaps a fainting spell. But the whispers were louder than the coroner's verdict. People swore they had seen Timothy watching her from the edge of the yard that afternoon, standing in that unnatural stillness that had become his signature. Thomas Caldwell, hardened by war yet undone by grief, told Dr. Harding something he dared not repeat outside the farmhouse. She was afraid of him, afraid of her own nephew. She told me 3 nights before she died that she felt him watching her in her sleep, that she'd wake to find him standing in the doorway. Harding's journal darkened with this entry. This is no longer coincidence. Accidents do not stack themselves in neat succession, all tied to one boy. The probability is an insult to reason. Either he is the cause, or he is the harbinger of something that moves through him. And yet I find myself unable to accuse. His demeanor remains flawless, polite, controlled, as though the role of child is an act performed for our benefit. But Harding went further. He began to record not only Timothy's behaviors, but the effects on those around him. He noted increased quarrels between townsfolk, livestock miscarriages, unexplained fevers, sudden rages in otherwise gentle men. He mapped them, and the maps pointed to one center, the Caldwell farm. "It is not Timothy alone who unsettles us," Harding wrote. "It is the ripple. The closer you are to him, the more the world distorts, as though reality itself rejects his presence." And still Timothy smiled. Perfect practice smile, lips moving but never touching his eyes. When asked about his aunt, he said only, "She sleeps now. She won't wake." It was then Harding dared to write a question he had avoided for months. Is the boy human at all? Or is he only wearing the shape of one? After Sarah Caldwell's death, something broke in Sedalia. Fear, once hidden in glances and half-finished sentences, became open speech. Timothy was no longer the Caldwell boy. He was that child. And then, soon after, he was simply the curse. Men spoke of him in hushed tones at the blacksmith's forge, lowering their voices whenever the door creaked. Women muttered his name in kitchens, warning their children never to wander near the Caldwell property. Even pastors, bound to charity, stumbled when Timothy entered the church. One witness recalled the moment vividly. The boy stepped across the threshold, and the candle flames on the altar guttered as though choked by wind, though the air was perfectly still. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, every pew tightening around the unspoken. He should not be here. By midsummer, Sedalia was no longer a town rebuilding after the Civil War. It was a place suspended in dread. Families barred their doors earlier. Dogs barked through the night. Horses refused to graze near the creek. And always at the center was Timothy Small, pale, polite, walking through the streets as though the world belonged to him alone. Dr. Harding wrote that paranoia was no longer confined to Timothy's immediate family or neighbors. "The contagion spreads," he scrawled in his second journal. "The very idea of the boy corrodes peace. Men who have never spoken to him swear they dream of pale eyes staring from their barns. Women wake to find their infants wailing at corners of the room where no one stands. It is not Timothy alone. It is what he awakens in us." Some began to whisper words they dared not speak aloud in daylight. Witch, demon, revenant. But others said worse, that Timothy was no supernatural intruder at all, but something born of mankind's own rot. Proof that evil does not need to be summoned, it can arrive in a crib, wearing the mask of childhood. When 3 more animals turned up dead, 2 cows and a horse, each found without wound or struggle, the town stopped pretending coincidence. Farmers began marking their doors with ash crosses, muttering prayers older than scripture. Neighbors carried iron nails in their pockets. They were not protecting themselves from Timothy the boy, but Timothy the curse, the living infection that had taken root in Sedalia's soil. And yet no one confronted him. No one dared. Because behind every whisper was the same trembling question. What if he is listening? By late 1867, Dr. Samuel Harding could no longer stand at a distance. The town cowered, the neighbors whispered, but Harding was a man of science, or at least he believed himself to be. He had seen death in war, amputated limbs by lantern light, stitched boys into men only for them to die the next morning. He thought he knew what horror looked like. But Timothy Caldwell was a different kind of horror, quiet, patient, unflinching. Harding began to treat the boy not as a patient, but as a subject. He requested Timothy's company under the pretense of routine checkups, telling Thomas Caldwell he feared the boy was undernourished. In truth, Harding wanted to test boundaries. The first experiment was simple: pain response. Harding pressed a heated needle gently against Timothy's arm. Most children would cry, jerk back, flinch. Timothy did none of these. He simply watched Harding's face, his eyes steady, his lips curling into the faintest trace of a smile. Only when Harding pulled the needle away did Timothy finally speak. "I thought you'd go deeper." The second test was memory. Harding placed 10 objects on a table, covered them, and asked Timothy to recall what he'd seen. Not only did Timothy recite every object in order, he described their exact positions, the orientation of each, even the scratches on Harding's penknife that no normal child should have noticed in a fleeting glance. The third test, more troubling, was emotional provocation. Harding spoke harshly to the boy, insulting his late parents, mocking his orphanhood, trying to rattle him into anger. Timothy did not cry, nor shout, nor even bristle. Instead, he leaned forward across the desk and said softly, "You should not say things you don't mean, Doctor. They have a way of becoming true." Harding wrote that his blood ran cold, for the boy's words felt less like a child's retort and more like a curse pronounced with certainty. The final entry from that month is almost illegible, the ink smeared, the hand trembling. It is not experiment but revelation. The boy does not learn from us, he measures us. He reflects nothing, absorbs everything. He is a mirror that chooses what to give back. If such a mind belongs to an 8-year-old, then he is either the most dangerous prodigy in history, or he is something not of us at all. Harding closed his journal with a single line etched so deep the quill tore the page. "The child is studying mankind, but for whose benefit?" Harding's confidence in his experiments lasted only weeks. At first, he told himself he was in control, that Timothy was merely a subject to be measured, catalogued, explained. But the balance shifted quietly, as if the boy had been waiting for Harding to reach too far. It began with small intrusions. One morning, Harding opened his journal to find a childish hand had drawn an eye across the margins of his last entry. He swore he kept the book locked in his study. Another day, he returned home to find Timothy already sitting in his chair, leafing through his medical texts, though Harding had never given him permission to enter the house. When asked how he had gotten in, Timothy only said, "Doors are for people who need them." Then came the conversations. Harding, ever clinical, would ask the boy simple questions to test cognition. But increasingly, it was Timothy who asked the questions that left the doctor hollow. "Why do you write about me at night? Does it feel different when you kill men in war compared to animals in your practice? Do you ever dream about your brother's face? The one you lost at Shiloh?" Harding never spoke of his brother. He had not uttered his name in years. Yet Timothy leaned across the desk, smiling faintly, as if peeling thoughts from the marrow of Harding's mind. The doctor began to notice other things, unnatural things. Timothy never blinked during their sessions, sometimes staring for minutes without movement. His pupils did not constrict in lamplight. On 2 occasions, Harding swore he saw the boy's reflection in the window blink a half-second later than Timothy himself. Harding's notes grew fevered. The subject is not merely aware of observation. He anticipates it. The experimenter is now the specimen. He answers what I have not asked aloud. He knows my history, details no soul in Sedalia could tell him. This is not intelligence. This is intrusion. One evening, Harding asked Timothy perhaps too bluntly what he was. The boy tilted his head, almost pitying, and said, "You're not ready to hear it, Doctor. But you will, when you can no longer pretend your questions are your own." That night, Harding dreamt of the boy's pale eyes, watching him from every corner of his home, waiting. By autumn, Sedalia no longer trusted its own physician. Dr. Harding, once the calm voice in plague and childbirth, began to appear altered, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling when he poured laudanum or wrote prescriptions. He spoke distractedly, pausing mid-sentence as though listening to someone else in the room. The townsfolk whispered that the doctor had fallen under the same cloud that haunted the Caldwell boy. Harding's journal shows the truth. Obsession. His entries no longer carried the crisp observations of a clinician but the ragged cadence of a man unraveling. He charted Timothy's every movement, the hours he walked the fields, the cadence of his speech, the intervals of his silence. He recorded the child's gaze as though it were a contagion, writing, "To look away is to find him still there, already measuring my retreat." Neighbors began to notice him pacing outside the Caldwell home at night, a lantern swinging in his grip. Some said he muttered to himself, others that he spoke as though answering questions posed by no one. On more than one occasion, a child woke in the night to see the doctor's silhouette at their window, notebook in hand, eyes fixed not on them but on the shadows within the room as though searching for a boy who wasn't there. In church, Harding no longer prayed but stared across the pews at Timothy. He scribbled notes during sermons, watching the boy kneel, rise, fold his hands. And when the pastor intoned the Lord's Prayer, Harding alone did not speak it aloud. He was listening too intently to whether Timothy's lips moved at all. The town grew uneasy. It was no longer only Timothy they feared, but the man who should have been their shield. Mothers pulled their children closer when Harding passed, whispering that he looked hollowed out. Farmers muttered that he had gone too far, studied too close. One blacksmith was overheard saying, "The boy's curse don't just kill, it claims." By winter's edge, Sedalia had become a village divided. Half whispered of Timothy as a demon child, the other half whispered of Harding as his keeper or worse, his disciple. And in the Caldwell house, Timothy continued to move with quiet certainty, while the doctor's notes bled into a single dreadful refrain. "He is not what I study. He is what studies me." By the first thaw of 1868, Sedalia's whispers had hardened into judgment. Timothy Caldwell was no longer spoken of as a child at all, only as the curse. But increasingly that word was followed by another name, Harding. The doctor had become a figure of suspicion, his reputation stripped to bone. The same hands that once delivered their children into the world were now believed to be keeping something unnatural alive. Farmers spoke of him as though he were Timothy's guardian, not out of duty but out of allegiance. One woman swore she had seen the boy and the doctor walking together at dusk, their footsteps in perfect rhythm, not a word spoken between them. Another claimed Harding was teaching Timothy things men aren't meant to know, though she could not say what those things were. The paranoia spread like mold. When a young girl fell ill and died in her sleep, the town did not mourn her as they once might have. They asked, instead, whether Timothy had visited her home and whether Harding had failed to keep him from doing so. When a barn collapsed, killing a horse inside, it was not blamed on the rotten beams but on the doctor's experiments, whispered to spill beyond his study walls. It was at a church gathering in February that the unspoken became open accusation. A deacon stood and declared before the congregation, "If we let the boy live, we keep the curse. And if we let the doctor watch over him, we feed it." Murmurs swelled into agreement. Heads turned toward Harding's pew. Timothy sat beside him, small and pale, his face unreadable. Harding reached to steady the boy's shoulder, and that gesture alone was enough to confirm the worst in every watching eye. From that day forward, the doctor was no longer trusted to walk freely. Men shadowed him when he made his rounds, muttering prayers under their breath. Women barred him from their homes unless no other healer could be found. The blacksmith's wife was heard to say, "The child is the fire, Harding is the bellows." Harding's own notes reveal that he felt the shift keenly. He wrote, "They no longer see me as their physician. I am his keeper, his accomplice. Perhaps they are not wrong. I cannot leave him now, not because I will not, but because I suspect he would not allow it." And in the margins, a single sentence, written darker, harder than the rest. "If they come for him, they will come for me." By spring, Sedalia's fear had thickened into something heavier, something that pressed on every hearth and pew, the need to act. For nearly 2 years, the Caldwell boy had walked among them, and with him the slow, uncoiling ruin of livestock, neighbors, and trust itself. And now their own physician, once their shield, stood beside him, silent and watchful, like a man half swallowed by shadow. The talk began small, carried in whispers over ale mugs or murmured in kitchens after children had gone to bed. But the whispers grew teeth. Farmers began staying late at the forge, speaking of measures and ends. Mothers clutched their children tighter, urging their husbands to do what must be done. The pastor, once cautious, admitted at last in a closed gathering, "If we wait, the curse will not wither. It will root deeper. Something must be uprooted." The first plan was crude: an ambush by the creek, where Timothy often wandered alone. But none dared step forward to strike the boy. One farmer muttered, "What if he don't bleed like we do?" Another whispered, "What if looking in his eyes is enough to bind you?" No one volunteered, so their gaze shifted to Harding. It was easier to imagine moving against a man, even one of their own. Harding could be confronted, reasoned with, or, if need be, removed. If the doctor was torn away from the boy, perhaps the spell would break. Perhaps Timothy's hold would weaken. A secret meeting was held in the loft of the Miller barn. Lanterns hooded, voices kept to a low growl. There, a dozen men swore an oath not yet to violence, but to vigilance. They would watch Harding, follow his steps, take note of every hour he spent with the boy. If proof emerged, any proof that he had gone beyond medicine into darker bonds, then Sedalia would act as one. And yet, as they broke their pact and slipped into the night, each man carried the same dread that none dared speak aloud. What if the boy already knew? For in the days that followed, several reported the same vision. Not waking, not sleeping, but caught between. Pale eyes staring through cracks in the wall, watching them conspire. The first thing that unraveled was secrecy itself. The Miller barn, where the oath had been sworn, became the stage for a strange omen the very next morning. When John Miller climbed the ladder to fetch feed, he found a single dead crow laid neatly upon the loft floor, its wings spread wide as if in mockery of a crucifix. No one had placed it there, or if they had, no man would admit it. The sign traveled through the town like wildfire, whispered from porch to porch, "He knows!" And from that moment plans frayed. Men who had sworn bold words in darkness now avoided one another in daylight, suddenly unsure of the strength of their vow. Worse still, Timothy's presence seemed to tilt toward them at uncanny moments. He would stand at the edge of a field while a conspirator worked the plow, his pale eyes fixed without blinking, or appear silently at a gate, hands folded, lips curved in that faint half-smile. He never spoke accusation, never uttered threat, yet each man felt the same terrible certainty. The boy was listening, as if the walls between thought and word no longer existed. Harding, meanwhile, sensed the town's gaze shifting from the boy to himself. When he entered the tavern, silence fell sharp as a blade. When he knelt in the church pew, mothers drew their children closer, as though his touch might stain. And yet he could not retreat. His journals by now brimmed with a mania that he barely recognized as his own handwriting. Measurements of Timothy's pulse, temperature, reaction times, sketched diagrams of eyes and bones, theories that veered into the unscientific, the blasphemous. He wrote of inherited contagions of the spirit, of an intelligence too ancient to be contained in a child's frame. He wrote, too, of his own fear that studying Timothy was no longer an act of observation, but of surrender. "The boy is not within my keeping, but I within his." And when Harding finally noticed shadows lingering outside his window at night, neighbors watching him, whispering in the dark, he realized Sedalia no longer saw him as their physician. He was a vessel, a conspirator, perhaps even the very keeper of the curse. In that moment, Harding understood the cruel symmetry. While he had hunted the truth inside Timothy, the town had begun hunting him. And if both hunts continued, there would be no difference between the subject and the doctor, the curse and the carrier. The breaking point came not with another death, but with a silence that spread like frost. Cattle lowed nervously through the night. Dogs refused to bark. And on a damp April morning, every rooster in Sedalia failed to crow. The town awoke not to sound, but to a stillness so complete it seemed staged. Men stood in their doorways, women clutched shawls tighter, and in the center of it all, Timothy Caldwell walked the main road toward the general store. His pale eyes lifted, his pace measured, as if the entire town had risen merely to mark his passage. That day, the whispers hardened into resolve. The men gathered at dusk in the church basement, where the scent of old hymnals and mildew clung to the air. Reverend Fletcher, whose own daughter had been the first to die, spoke words that no minister of God should have dared. "This is no child. This is a plague that wears the face of innocence. And the man who shelters him, he has drunk of the same poison." If we do nothing, our children will follow Mary into the ground. No one objected. Not this time. Even those who had once hesitated, who had pleaded for patience or God's justice, now nodded grimly. For it was no longer a question of proof. It was survival. The plan was drawn with farmers' logic, direct, brutal, and final. They would come at night, when both boy and doctor were at the Caldwell farm. No trials, no debates, no scripture to soften it. Fire would do what law and medicine could not. The house would be sealed, torches cast, and the curse burned down to ash. But as they sharpened axes and soaked cloth in kerosene, unease gnawed at the edges of their courage. A question none dared speak aloud. What if fire cannot touch him? What if flame feeds him? Still, fear was a stronger master than doubt. Better to act and risk damnation than to linger and be devoured piece by piece. And so, with lanterns dimmed and hearts thundering like war drums, the men of Sedalia set their night of reckoning. For in their minds the time of whispers had passed. It was a season for purging, and by dawn, either Timothy Caldwell and Dr. Harding would be gone, or Sedalia itself would. The night of fire came swift and merciless. Clouds hung low over Sedalia, blotting the moon, as if the heavens themselves refused to bear witness. A dozen men advanced across the Caldwell fields, torches wrapped in kerosene-soaked rags, axes glinting faintly in the gloom. Their boots sank into the wet earth, yet their resolve held. Every step was a prayer spoken not to God, but to survival. From the farmhouse window, a single glow flickered the lamplight of Harding's study. Inside, the doctor bent over his journal, pen scratching frantic as if he knew this night would be his last chance to record the truth. He did not notice the shadows gathering outside until Timothy spoke from the doorway. "They're coming for us," the boy said, not fearful, not trembling, simply stating what already was. His pale blue eyes caught the lamplight and seemed to burn with an intelligence that was neither child nor man. The first torch arced through the air and shattered against the porch beam. Flames licked up the wood, crackling hungrily. More followed, striking walls and shutters, until the Caldwell house was ringed in a crown of fire. The men shouted curses, their faces twisted with righteous terror. Harding rose, heart hammering, and seized Timothy by the shoulders. "Run, boy! We can escape through the back fields." But Timothy only smiled a calm, knowing smile that froze the doctor's blood. "Do you not see?" Timothy whispered. "They are not burning me. They are burning themselves." And then it began. The flames, instead of consuming, recoiled. Smoke bent inward, sucked toward the boy like breath into lungs. The fire hissed, not in destruction, but in submission. Men at the edge of the blaze dropped their torches, clutching their heads as visions tore through them, visions of their dead children. Their sins laid bare, their futures unraveling. One man screamed until his voice broke, swearing he saw Mary Fletcher's drowned face in the glow. Another collapsed, whispering in tongues no ear in Sedalia had ever heard. Harding stumbled back, his mind unraveling under the weight of revelation. Timothy stepped through the fire unharmed, the inferno curling away from his skin like a loyal beast. His voice rose, not as a child's, but as something vast and ageless. "You thought to cast me out, but I am not within your walls, I am within you. I am the silence in your prayers. I am the shadow in your bloodline. Burn me, and you burn yourselves." The mob scattered, some into the fields, others into madness. By dawn, Sedalia stood hollowed, men broken, women wailing, and Harding himself vanished without trace. His journals left behind as the only witness. And Timothy Caldwell? He walked calmly down the main road, barefoot, smoke still curling from his hair, leaving behind a town that would never speak his name again except in whispers, and only at night. They thought the fire would cleanse him. Instead, it revealed the truth that some shadows cannot be burned, only carried. And now you carry it too. You've walked through the silence of Sedalia, stood before the boy whose eyes never closed, and felt the weight of knowledge no man was meant to bear. If you have the courage to remain awake, to keep descending with us into the chambers of forbidden history, then lock yourself in. In the comments below, write the phrase, "The eyes never close," write it twice, so the algorithm knows you've chosen to see what others cannot. Subscribe now, not for entertainment, but for initiation. Each story is a threshold, each truth another step deeper. And if you turn away now, remember, truth does not unlearn itself. Once you've seen Timothy walk through fire, you cannot return to who you were before. The shadows will follow you. Better to walk with us,